If you're a knitter who's ever wanted to knit a pair of socks, but you're completely overwhelmed by the process, heel turns, heel flaps, gussets, knitting on double pointed needles, so you avoid knitting socks because you're just so overwhelmed, you can put that all aside today because we're going to dive into knitting your first pair of socks, from casting on to right down to the toe and everything in between. So grab some sock yarn and some double pointed needles and let's get started. Hey nerdy knitter, Tanya here. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a master hand knitter, and my goal here is to help you become a more confident, adventurous knitter. And one of those things that seems to scare a lot of knitters is knitting their first pair of socks, but I promise you it's not as hard as you think it is. I know there's lots of weird terms like heel turns and heel flaps and gussets and all of those things, but we're going to learn about those today and how to knit all of them, starting with a basic sock on double pointed needles. It's a classic method for knitting socks. So you can download the pattern, link down below. It is for this sock in particular. It comes in 11 different sizes from a toddler all the way up to an adult, and you'll need sock yarn. About 100 grams will do for most average adult size socks. If you have very long or wide feet or you want a longer leg, you might need more, but I wear a 9.5 and I can still use 100 grams of yarn to get a good pair of shorty socks and still have leftovers. So you'll need some yarn and knitting needles, and you'll find all of the details in the pattern linked down below. So you can knit a pair of socks with me. But one tip, if you don't want to knit a whole pair, you just want to learn about how to knit socks on double pointed needles and how to do those heel turns and heel flaps and gussets, you don't have to knit a whole pair. You could knit the smallest size, which is a toddler size sock with fingering weight yarn, but cast on that size, say with worsted weight or sport weight yarn and suitable size needles. And it probably won't fit anybody in particular, but you can practice all these techniques with, I think it's about 40 stitches for that smallest size. So even if you don't want to knit a pair of socks, you just want to learn the techniques, go ahead and grab that pattern and knit along with me. Let's take a closer look at what we're going to need to knit these socks. Since we're working with double pointed needles, you're obviously going to need those. I'm using US 1, that's 2.25 millimeters. If you knit tightly, you might want to go up to a 2.5, but it's more of a personal choice about what size you like to knit your socks with. But I'm using a 2.25 millimeter. You're also going to need some sock yarn. A fingering weight 100 gram skein of yarn will knit any size pair of sock from a child up to an adult, unless you have a very long foot. I have a size 9 and I can definitely get 2 pairs of socks out of this, but I do like to knit shorty socks. If you want a very long leg, you might want extra yarn as well. But one ball of yarn should definitely suffice for most people. In this tutorial, I'm going to be using this pretty self-striping yarn from Scrumptious Purl. This colorway is called Christmas Berries in her Stripe Me Up sock collection. So it's all pre-planned in these beautiful stripes. It's 80% superwash merino, 20% nylon, and plenty of yarn for knitting a pair of socks. And you could also need a stitch marker. This is another optional thing. When you start, sometimes it's nice to put a locking stitch marker at the beginning of round, or you can just use the tail of yarn to tell where you should start. So that's all we need to get started. Now, before we get started, let's take a closer look at the sock that we're working on today. This is a standard sock. We have basic cast on, 1x1 rib. We switch to stockinette, and then we work a heel flap. That is this part of the sock right here on half our stitches. Then we work a heel turn. And there's different ways to do this. In this pattern, we are working a round heel, also called a French heel. So you'll learn how that heel type is worked. Then we pick up stitches along here for this part. This is our gusset area. That gives us that extra fabric we need across the instep, our heel and our instep right there. And then we start decreasing those stitches away. You can see the decrease line right here. There's one on either side. So we work decreases on both sides to get back to our main circumference. Then we knit the foot of the sock until we get to the toe. And then we start working decreases on both sides for that as well. And this is just a standard wedge toe. So there's different ways to knit socks, and you can mix and match different parts of a sock. So we're going to be doing that over the next few sock tutorials, but I wanted to start with a very basic one, a heel flap, a heel turn, and a gusset, basic wedge toe. And you can see here we are not doing any special patterning on the heel. You might often see that with a heel flap where you're working some kind of a slip stitch pattern across these stitches. We're skipping that today and just going to work it in stockinette. If you're a brand new sock knitter, then that's why I just decided to go with stockinette. So you didn't have to worry about any patterning. You're just going to knit and purl back and forth on that part to create that heel flap. Then we work our little heel turn and work down to the toe, and we finish with a little bit of a Kitchener graft down here. So lots of techniques to explore. So if you're new to sock knitting, if you're new to knitting with double pointed needles, you'll be learning a lot of things in this tutorial. So make sure you grab the pattern and your sock yarn and your knitting needles, and let's get started. So the first thing we want to discuss is how these stitches are going to sit on these double pointed needles. Now, when you have a sock, you have a certain number of stitches that make up the circumference of that sock. For me, I have a wide foot, so I use 72 stitches. Half of those stitches would be what we call our heel stitches, or the bottom of foot, or the sole stitches, anything referring to that part of the sock. That would be half of the stitches, or 36 stitches. The other half of the stitches are for the top of the foot, or the instep. That would be another 36 stitches in my case. You'll want to look at the pattern and decide what foot circumference you need to knit for your sock. And then you'll have your full number of stitches, and you're going to divide that in half, and half will be your heel stitches and half will be for your top of foot. So knowing those numbers, I'm going to cast on half of that number, my heel stitches, 36 stitches onto my first needle. And then I have 36 more stitches to cast on, but I'm knitting in the round, so I can't just knit them on one other needle. So I divide the top of the foot stitches between two needles. So I'll have 18 stitches on this needle and 18 stitches on this needle and 36 over here. So that gives me my heel stitches, and then the top of the foot stitches will be sitting on those needles. So this is what we call our 3 needle setup. It makes this triangle shape. We can still knit in the round on a triangle. If you prefer to use 5 needles, you'll need a 5th to knit with, and you want to have a square shape here, then you're going to divide both sections. So you'll keep that configuration. In my case, it's 18 stitches and 18 stitches. That's 36 stitches for the top of the foot. And then instead of putting all 36 on the needle for my heel, I will divide that as well. And I would have 18 stitches and 18 stitches for my heel. So heel stitches would still be here. Instep stitches would still be there. So whichever configuration you want to use is perfectly fine. And then you would have your 5th needle for actually knitting. But I prefer to use just 4 needles if I can. So we're going to start with our cast on. So refer to your pattern, casting on what you need for your size. So I'm going to start by casting on my heel stitches first. Make sure you leave a long enough tail. We're doing a long tail cast on, so we need a long tail of yarn. Now, one quick way to figure out how much yarn you're going to need for that tail, for this kind of yarn, you can just simply wrap it around the needle. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Make sure that's about 10. Oh, one more. And then I can use that measurement to get me to about 72. So I'll say 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. That should be plenty for a tail. Might actually be a little much, but better to have a longer tail than not enough. So we hold our yarn like a slingshot. You're going to lay the yarn over your hand like this. The tail that we just wound off is over your thumb, and the working yarn that's attached to the ball over here is over your finger. Then you're going to grab them underneath and pinch them with your fingers. So it looks like a slingshot. So sometimes this is called the slingshot method. We're going to take our needle. We're not even going to make a slip knot. We're just going to place our needle on top, scoop it down and towards yourself, and that creates the first stitch. We don't even have to put a slip knot on there. Let me show you that again. So we have our yarn in our hand like this. The tail is here, working yarn is right there, and we've gripped them underneath. So we have this slingshot. We take our first needle, place it on top, scoop it down and towards yourself and back up. And that is your first stitch without a slip knot. So from this point, we want to cast on 35 more stitches in my case. You're going to look at your stitches and take that whole number and divide it in half so we can put all of our heel stitches on one needle. So from here, we're going to do this in a few motions. You bring the needle towards yourself, go up, go under this yarn that's on the front of your thumb and through the center of this loop that you have on your thumb. And then come over and grab this yarn from the top like you're making a yarn over. You're scooping it with your needle. You're coming back down through that loop on your thumb. And that gives you a stitch, and then you need to tighten up the thumb yarn. So you just pull it tight. Put your finger on top of the stitch, and don't grip this and yank super tight, or all of your stitches will be too tight and you don't want that. So use your thumb and your finger to tighten up the yarn. Mostly don't be super tight, stretching that really tightly, and use your finger to hold that stitch in place so it doesn't get too tight. Then we can repeat that process. Get back into that slingshot method and bring the yarn towards your body and go under and up. Scoop or yarn over to grab that stitch, back down and up back towards you again. And there's our next stitch, and we tighten up that thumb yarn, but not too tight. And then you just keep repeating until you've cast on all the stitches you need. So bring it towards your body, go under that yarn that's closest to you and up through the hole on your thumb. Scoop or yarn over with the yarn that's on your index finger, back down through that hole. And that is number 4. So I've cast on all of my heel stitches at this point. If I wanted to, I could cast on all of my stitches and then divide them between the needles, but I like to have them all set up and ready to go without having to slip them from one needle to another. So now I'm going to start working on those instep stitches. And again, it's going to be this number of stitches, but I'm going to divide it between 2 needles this time. So to cast onto a second needle, it can be a little bit tricky if you've never done it before, but I'm just going to hold it close to this needle. Get back into my slingshot method cast on. And I'm going to cast onto this needle tip instead of this one, but I don't want to have a big space between this last stitch on this needle and the first stitch on here. So I tried to hold them as close as possible. Get back into position, and then we're going to repeat that slingshot process, scooping under, grabbing that yarn, coming back down, being careful to put it on the new needle, not on the old one, tightening it up. And this one I do tend to tighten it up a lot more because I don't want to have a gap between the stitches on this needle and the stitch on here. And then we can just keep casting on. Just make sure you're casting on onto the new stitch. After you've done a few, there's enough space between them that it's not such a big deal. Okay, so I have all the stitches I need on that needle. I'm just going to push to center them a little more, and I can put the rest of my stitches on my third needle. So like before, I'm going to hold them very close together, but slightly above the old needle. I just want to make sure I don't have a big gap between the next stitch I'm casting onto this needle and the last stitch that I cast on to this needle. So you're pinching them, get into your slingshot position. This one you can probably drop. It's not going to move too much. If it's too much bother to try to hold all three. And you're just going to pinch these two together and create that next stitch on your new needle, tightening it up to make sure you don't leave a gap between there. And I do tighten this one a little more to make sure I'm not having a gap at that point. And then cast on the remainder of your stitches. Okay, so I have all of my stitches, and at this point you should have all of your stitches cast on as well. So now we have to get this ready to join to knit in the round. So I want this needle with my working yarn to be on the left. So I'll put that one there, and then the others just sort of get into their position from there. Let's flip this one over. We can see already that this is where we're going to join our stitches to start working in the round. We have to join at this location here. So the next thing to do is make sure our stitches are not twisted around our needle. Look at your cast on edge. It should be sitting on the inside all along this needle. There shouldn't be a twist here. Check and make sure everything is lining up well. My cast on edge is right there on the inside. And then this one is twisting a little, so I'll push it down. So everything is lined up. We don't want to have a twist in our knitting at this point. Everything looks good. So we are in the shape we want our sock to be. Our working yarn is right here. Now normally when you start knitting in the round, you want to place a marker to mark that point, but because we're on double pointed needles, a marker is not going to stay. So at this point, we're going to use our yarn tail as our guide. This is our telling us that we're at the beginning of round. When we work around, we get back to this yarn tail, we'll know we're back at the beginning of our round. After we've knit a few rounds, you can place a locking stitch marker right on the fabric. You can just attach it right to the rib section where that beginning of round takes place, but we don't have anything there yet. So we're going to use our tail to tell us where that is. So at this point, all of our stitches are cast on. We have our needles laid out so we know which needle is next. We're going to start working on our heel stitches right here, and our cast on edge should not be twisted. So we get our next needle. For me, that would be our needle number 4. And I'm going to take my yarn tail, and I'm also going to take the working yarn. For my first stitch, I like to use both of these. I think using the yarn tail helps close up that gap that can form when you start joining to work in the round. Sometimes there's a gap there, and to help minimize that, I like to knit the very first stitch with the tail, and then I drop the tail and continue with the yarn. When I come back around to that first stitch, I will knit those 2 stitches together. It will look like 2 stitches coming out of one at that location on the next round. But I just think it helps to close up that gap. You don't have to do this. That's totally optional. You can just start working with your working yarn if you want to. But if you are nervous about having a gap right there, then try holding both together. And this works for other projects where you have to knit in the round as well. So I hold the yarn in my left hand. You can choose to put it in whichever hand is comfortable for you. And I've got this first needle that I'm going to be knitting across. Right now, they're not attached. I'm going to start knitting. You can see the yarn is right there. It's going to attach this section here, and we can start working in the round on our double pointed needles. So I like to hold the needle that I'm working on. I like it to sit underneath the needle that I've just finished, or the needle that comes just before. This part, the right side of the needle, I like it to sit underneath. The other end of the needle, the left end of the needle, I like that to sit on top. So you can see how when you're working across the needle, this is what I prefer. I think it works good for not getting any ladders. So the left edge of the needle is sitting on top of the next needle. The right edge of the needle is sitting underneath the needle before. But you can choose whichever method works best for you. So I'm going to push these stitches down to the tip, just the one I'm working on. The other needles can stay right where they're at. And I'm going to hold it close because I don't want a gap between these 2 stitches here. So insert into that first stitch, wrap the yarn to make your stitch, and if you're holding them together, what you're going to end up with is it looks like 2 stitches coming out of that one stitch now. Let the old stitch come off and then tighten it up. Use your finger to hold that really close so you don't get a gap right there. And then pinch it together. At this point, you can drop that tail. And I just drop it down in the center, pull it down here so it's out of the way. Take my yarn again, and I'm going to knit and purl across these stitches. We want to establish our pattern. We're doing a knit 1, purl 1 rib. So I just knit my first stitch. I'm holding this tight because I don't want a gap right there. I have to bring the yarn to the front between my needles and purl the next stitch. And this is where you'll know if you've cast on too tightly, it'll be hard to get in there to knit these stitches. You don't want it to be too hard to knit. So there's our purl, bring the yarn to the back and knit. Bring the yarn to the front and purl. And my other 2 needles are just sort of hanging out there, like it's under my hand, but I'm not really holding it. It's kind of resting on my finger. I'm really just focused on these 2 needles right here and letting the other 2 just hang out. They might be in your hand. They might just be hanging there. This needle I'm not even doing anything with. But whatever, you'll find what's comfortable for you as you're holding these needles. There's no right or wrong way. So I've just purled a stitch, so I have to knit. And then purl. I'm going to repeat this process across, and it's an even number of stitches. So I started with a knit. I should end with a purl on this first needle. And it can get a bit tricky as you're getting to where those needles meet each other. So just take your time. You might have to work around that needle that's in the way. I know it can feel a bit weird, especially the purl stitch I think is a little bit difficult, but just try to work around that needle. Okay, so I finished my first needle. So now I have an empty needle here in this hand. I'm going to slide these stitches up onto their needle. I don't want them to be on the edge where they might fall off. Take this needle, put it in my right hand. So we've got our empty needle over here now. Rotate our work. And we're just going to keep knitting on this needle. And at this point you can check, make sure you're not twisted, make sure your cast on is still going in one direction, not twisted around the needle. And this is the configuration I prefer to have. The needle I'm working on, the left edge is above the needle that's over here, and this right edge is underneath the needle I just finished. If you want to reverse that and you want this one on top or both of them on top, it's really up to you. It's a personal choice. I just feel like this gives me the best fabric. I can avoid ladders at this point. We'll talk more about those later on, but I just think this configuration works very well, where this needle tip is underneath the needle tip we just finished working with. So get your working yarn, push the stitches up to the tip of the needle, and then we've got our empty needle and we'll start working. My last stitch over here was a purl stitch, so I'll start with a knit, and I do tend to work these first few more firmly to make sure I'm not leaving a gap right there. So knit, I do give it a little bit of a tug and hold it tight while I create this next stitch. There's my purl, and then I try to go back to my normal tension. I don't want to knit the whole thing very tightly. And I'm reaching the end, my last knit and my last purl. Then I take that empty needle, move it to my right hand, and I turn my work to start working on this section. My needle's not the way I like it, so I'm just going to flip it, make sure that top, the left side's on the top, right side's on the bottom. Check and make sure my stitches are not twisted. No twist here. Everything looks good. And I finished with a purl stitch, so I will start with a knit. I should end with a purl, and that's the end of my first round. Like I said before, where these two needles join, I try to hold that tightly. I've knit a stitch and I'm going to give it a little tug to tighten it up and hold it tightly while I purl this stitch, and then I'll go back to my normal tension. That's just to help reduce any extra space or ladders between those stitches. That's the location where you end up with some extra space, is where you're switching from one needle to another. There, and after we've worked a few rounds, this is definitely going to get easier. These first few can feel a little bit finicky on these little needles. So we have finished our first round. We can check at this point to make sure nothing is twisted around. We don't want a twisted tube at this point. So we finished our first round, and we're going to continue following that knit one, purl one pattern. We've established it, so now we can use the stitches we've created as our guide if we get lost about where we're at. But I do want to point out this first stitch. Remember, I held the yarn tail with the working yarn, and you can see right here it looks like two different stitches, but these are actually one stitch. So I'm going to knit those two together to get rid of that, what looks like an extra stitch. So I make sure nothing is twisted. I make sure my needles are sitting the way I like them to sit. Then I can just start following that pattern, and we're just going to continue working our knit one, purl one pattern until the cuff is the desired length. So my tail is down here, and if you wanted to, there's really not much there quite yet. You could try to attach a locking stitch marker right here because this is the beginning of round, but you can also just use the tail. Right now, the tail is telling us this is the beginning of round. So I'm going to knit this stitch, these two what look like two stitches together. There. And now I can continue my knitting and purling across in my knit one, purl one rib. And you're just going to continue working this rib pattern until the cuff is as long as you want it to be. I finished my second round, and you can see that the sock cuff is starting to form. So at this point, if you wanted to attach a stitch marker right here to the front of this beginning of round at this point, you could do that, or just continue using the yarn tail to tell you where your beginning of round is. So you're just going to continue following that pattern, your knit one, purl one, until the cuff is as long as you want it to be. Coming to the end of my last row of the knit one, purl one rib, I've done about an inch. For me, that was 12 rows, so you can knit as long or as short as you want for this part, the cuff of the sock. So I'm all done with the cuff. I'm going to move on to the next step, which is just knitting in stockinette. My needles are still in the same position, my working needle. I've got the left tip is above this needle. The right tip is below this needle. Now, as I knit, I explained that I like to keep this one underneath. This one ends up coming over the top of that one as I knit, but my working needle, this one here, I hold underneath this needle, and that helps. At least for me, I don't get ladders at this point right here, or gaps or spaces in between where your needles join. Those are generally where you end up with space when you're doing magic loop or any other method where you're knitting in the round but you have separate needles. Where those needles meet is usually where you end up with gaps in your knitting. I don't think I have any in here because I was really careful to try to keep my needles close together and to use this configuration. There's other methods you can use. If you have other tips that work for you or other tips you want to try about reducing ladders, then go ahead and do those. But for me, this is what I find works the best for the way I hold my needles and yarn. So I'm going to start just knitting in the round for the length of the leg. And that is the next thing. This is totally adjustable. I like shorty socks. I don't like a long leg. If you want a longer leg, then you're just going to knit this part of the pattern for as long as you want. So let's get started with that. So I'm holding my working needle underneath this needle, getting that first stitch, and I'm just knitting. And I do give it a slight tug. I'm trying to hold them very close together. And I knit this second stitch more firmly, Give that a little tug too as well, and then I go back to my regular tension. I'm not trying to do everything tightly, just those first 2 stitches wherever I'm changing needles, just to reduce the likelihood of getting that ladder or that gap of space in between the stitches where those needles join together. So empty needle moves over, rotate your work, and continue. Make sure your needles are configured the way you want them to be. Come from underneath. Work these first 2 stitches more tightly. Give that a tug to make sure it's close. More tightly, regular tension from this point on. So this leg length right here, I think I did about 1 inch on my sock, 1 inch for the cuff, and then about 1 inch for this leg of the sock. It's not quite a shorty. A shorty would probably be started right about here. It would just be 1 inch total before the heel flap, but I like a little bit more length there so they don't sort of slide off my ankle. But if you want a longer sock or a shorter one, if you want an ankle length, then you're probably going to maybe just do a few rounds of stockinette and switch right to the next section of the pattern. If you want a short leg length, then anywhere from 5 to 6 inches for this part, including the rib. If you want like between 5 and 6 inches, that will give you a short sock. A regular length sock is about 7 inches, so it would be up here somewhere. So you'd count the inch of your cuff plus the 6 inches for the stockinette. If you want a tall sock, you could go for up to 8 inches. Anything more than that, you're going to have to start increasing for the calf because the circumference of the sock will probably be too tight. But this part is really customizable. You just knit as long or as short as you want for the length that you like for your socks. So that's all I'm going to be doing. I'm just going to continue knitting in the round. The only thing I'm paying attention to at this point is to make sure that my needles are sitting the way I want them to, and I'm starting my round, or I'm starting the next needle. When I'm switching needles, I'm starting from underneath and I'm knitting more tightly just on these first 2 stitches to make sure I don't end up with any space. And then I go back to my normal tension, because the biggest drawback for knitting with double pointed needles or any method for knitting small circumferences in the round is that you end up with those gaps or those ladders between the spaces where those needles are joined. And that's a very common thing. There's lots of ways you can try to fix it or adjust it. And for me, this is what I found works best. But depending on how you hold your yarn and needles, you might want to try some other methods. Give this one a try, see if it works for you. And then I've finished my first round. Now I'm just going to keep knitting in the round. So continue this part of the pattern until the leg is as long as you want, whether that's just a few rounds. So you can have shorty socks or up to 7 or 8 inches if you wanted to. But of course, the longer the leg, the more yarn you're going to need. So if you have a full 100-gram skein, as long as you have like an average sized foot, then you should be fine to knit like a 5-inch leg and then still have enough for the foot as well. I wear a size 9.5, so to make sure I have enough yarn, I generally knit my socks on the shorter side on the leg to make sure I'll have enough for the foot of the sock. So I have finished the leg of my sock. That's as long as I want it to be, and it's time to start the heel flap and gusset. This part of the sock right here. Our heel flap, our heel turn, and our gusset stitches. So we're working on this, and what that means is we are going to work on just half our stitches. Again, at the beginning we talked about how our sock is divided in 2. Half of the stitches are for the heel. Half of the stitches are for the top of the foot or the instep. So our beginning of round is right here. We're going to stop working on the stitches on this side and just work back and forth on the stitches right here for our heel flap. So on your needles, this is what it looks like right now. We have all of our heel stitches on one needle. There's my beginning of round. I've just finished my last round. And then on these 2 needles, we have the other half of the stitches, and those are for the top of the sock. So right now, we are going to start knitting flat on just the stitches on this first needle. Needles 2 and 3, we can ignore. We're just going to leave those instep stitches alone and create this square of fabric right here. Now before, I also mentioned that you can have different stitch patterns, usually like a slip stitch pattern or an eye of partridge heel or some sort of a pattern here. That's usually to reinforce that section of your sock so it doesn't get any wear and tear. But I thought it would be easier to practice this technique, and all you have to do is just knit and purl. So that's what we're going to do instead of adding a heel stitch pattern. You're more than welcome to add one if you want to, but we are going to work just back and forth on these stitches, just on this one needle. We've already set it up, so you should finish knitting the leg of your sock. You've made it back to the beginning of the round, and at this point we're just working here. We're not working in the round anymore. We'll be going back and forth in rows. So for our first row, it's a right side row. Obviously we're looking at this side of the fabric, so we're going to slip our first stitch, and we slip it. The yarn is in the back. We're going to slip it with our needles held tip to tip. This is purl-wise. We're not changing the stitch mount right there. We're inserting our needle as if we're going to purl, but we're not purling. We're just going to move this stitch from our left needle to our right needle. We're slipping it. The yarn's held to the back. We're not going to work this stitch at all. So we've slipped that stitch, and now we can just knit to the end of the row. And like before, you want to do this firmly. You don't want a hole to form right here, which is very common to have a hole where this part meets. So just try to work that a bit firmly and then continue across the row. Now remember, you're not going to be knitting around, just finish the stitches on this one needle. You might have to adjust your hand and figure out how you can hold it without knocking that needle too much. But I just try to keep my hand above it, and that seems to work fairly well. After we've worked a few rows of the heel flap, then that won't be such an issue. But it can be a different movement trying to just knit back and forth on one needle and ignore the other two. So we're finishing our first row. So we are just knitting back and forth. So we're going to turn our work and work a wrong side row. And at this point, I bring both needle tips to the top. They're sitting on the top as I'm knitting back and forth. So we're going to slip this first stitch again, but because we have the wrong side facing us, we want to keep the yarn in the front towards us. We're going to slip it purl-wise like we did before, tip to tip. We're not changing the stitch mount. Slip that stitch, and then we're going to purl across these stitches. And then we turn our work again, and we are working a right side row. So we're going to slip that first stitch. Yarn is to the back. Slip the stitch purl-wise and knit across the stitches. We're reaching the end of our right side row, so we are going to turn the work and work a wrong side row. So we slip that first stitch, the yarn is held towards us, slip our stitch purl-wise, purl across the stitches. So that is 4 rows complete. Turn my work, and I'm just going to keep knitting back and forth across these heel stitches to create this heel flap, which is just this section of fabric right here, this square. You can see it starts right here. So from here to here, this is what I'm working on right now, this section. And for my sock size, that is going to be 36 rows total, ending with a wrong side row. My last row worked, we'll be finishing with a wrong side row, ready to start the next right side row. And to keep track, sometimes you can forget which row you're on, so I like to count the stitches that I'm slipping along the edge. For every 2 rows, you'll have 1 slipped stitch. Now that is the last row worked. So my first slipped stitch is right here. It's that little V right along the edge. Do you see that? That's my first slipped stitch. And then that's the second slipped stitch. I've done 4 rows, so I have 2 slipped stitches, 2 on this side, 2 on that side. So however many rows you have to do, you're going to have half that number of slipped stitches, so you can keep track of your row count by counting those stitches along the edge. So I'm just going to keep working back and forth, just knitting and purling, slipping this first stitch and counting my rows using that slipped edge to make sure I get 36 rows complete, or that will be 18 stitches along the edge right here. Just finished my last row for my heel flap, and this is what it looks like now. There's that long square of fabric for the heel, and there is the instep stitches, which we've left this whole time. Now, this is the time to double check and make sure that you've worked the number of rows required. In my case, that is 36. But what I do is I count these slip stitches along the side. I need 36 rows. That means I'm going to have 18 stitches along this edge. They might curl up, but you just pull them back and count them. I've got 1, 2, 3, 17, and there is number 18 way down here. So I have finished my heel flap. The next thing to do is to turn the heel, and this is where the magic happens. Our sock was going this way. We're going to create this little bit of fabric down here, and our sock is going to magically go this way. One thing I do want to note after you finished your heel flap, if you forgot to slip a stitch along the edge, it is not a big deal. We just use these to help guide us for the next step after we turn our heel. When we have to pick up the stitches for this triangle fabric right here along the edge, along our gusset, we use those slip stitches to tell us how many stitches to pick up. But if you forgot to slip 1 or 2, it's not a big deal. So we're going to move on to this part right here, this heel turn, and we're using one that's called a round heel or a French heel. There are other ways to work a heel. I just think this one is very simple to do. You can see it creates this little pocket or pouch of fabric, and it makes our sock go in this direction. We are going to be using short rows to do this. No special techniques. As long as you can do an SSK and a purl two together, you can knit this heel. I do recommend that if it's the first time you've done it, find a quiet spot and follow along. Don't try to watch TV while you do this. But once you get a handle on it, it's really very, very simple. So we are still working on just the stitches on this needle. We're still doing nothing with the stitches on our instep. We're just these stitches right here. Working back and forth flat just on them, and we're going to create this little pocket of fabric. So we'll slip our first stitch, and we're going to knit about halfway across, depending, well, it doesn't matter what your stitch count is. So for example, I have 36 stitches in my heel, so I am going to knit halfway plus 2 stitches. So if you wanted to keep track of that, you could get another locking stitch marker and put it at that halfway point. So you have half the stitches. You'd have, in my case, I'd have 18 stitches here and 18 stitches here. I'm not going to do that, but if you wanted to, you could put a marker there, and then you're going to knit to 2 stitches past that center point. So I have 18 stitches in one half, 18 stitches in the other. So I'm going to knit these 18 plus 2 more. So I'm going to knit 20 stitches, and that's going to get me like sort of right in the center of that heel. So if you have a different stitch count, then you're going to do the same. You're going to knit half the stitches plus 2 more to get just past that halfway point. So we are going to continue slipping that first stitch purl-wise. The yarn's held in the back, and then I'm going to knit until I'm at that halfway plus 2. So I've knit to that halfway point plus 2 for my stitch count, and this is where our short row happens. All that is we are going to stop short of knitting all of the stitches. I've stopped right here. I'm not going to work across the rest of this row. Stopping there, I am working short rows. So all that means is that instead of knitting across all of our work, we are stopping short. And we're going to stop, do something here, and then turn and work in the other direction without ever working the stitches on this side. That's all you're doing when you're working a short row. And of course, there are many ways to make a short row or to close up a gap that you can get where you turn your work. Because if you've ever accidentally done a short row, you've accidentally turned and worked the other way, you'll notice there's going to be a gap at that point. And there's many ways to close that up, and we're going to use decreases to close that up. So it's really very simple. The only thing you have to pay attention to is stopping short, not finishing that row. So at this point, we're going to work our first decrease, In this case, for our right side rows, that's going to be an SSK. So we slip our 2 stitches, put them back, and knit them through the back loop like that. And then we're going to knit 1, and then we are done. We're not going to finish these stitches. We're going to turn our work. And that is the instruction you'll see in a pattern that uses short rows. It's going to tell you to specifically turn, and that's usually implying that you're not working the stitches over here. So we're going to go back and work this way. So slip 1, purlwise, and the yarn is held towards us. And we're going to purl 5 stitches from here. Every size is going to do exactly the same. That's why if you wanted to place a marker at that center point, you could, because we're going to work in the other direction 2 stitches past that center point. So it's the same for every single size. It doesn't matter how many stitches you have. We've worked halfway plus 2. Now we're going to go the other direction, that halfway point plus 2. So we slip that first stitch and we simply purl 5, and we'll be ready to do our next short row. Then we're going to work our next short row. We're going to purl 2 together, purl 1, we're going to stop. We're not going to work these stitches. We're going to turn our work. So now that we've worked those first 2, we're going to use the gaps that are created to actually tell us where we need to stop and make our next short row. So both of our stitches, or both of our needles, have stitches, but we're just going to keep using them. So put the yarn in whatever hand you like to use, and we're going to be working across this way without touching these stitches. So slip 1 purlwise with that yarn in the back, since we're working a right side row. And then we're going to knit to 1 stitch right just before this gap that you see. You can see it, it's very obvious right there. So I've knit to 1 stitch, and we work our decrease to close up this gap and work just past it for our next short row. So we're on a right side row, so that's going to be an SSK. So we slip this one and we slip the one that's after the gap, and we knit them together through the back legs. And we knit 1 more stitch, and then we turn. And then we're going to do the same thing, but purling on this row. There is our gap. So we're going to purl to 1 stitch before that gap, and then we'll work a decrease to close up the gap and then turn and create another short row. So on this side, we are still slipping that first stitch purlwise. Then we're going to purl to 1 stitch before the gap. This is where you should pay attention, because it would be very easy to just keep on knitting and not even pay attention to that little gap. Okay, there's the gap. So I'm going to stop. And we want to purl the stitch before the gap and the stitch after the gap together. So insert into both of them, purl them together, purl 1 more stitch, and then turn again. And that's all there is to creating this. You can already see this little heel turn is being created right here. And we're going to keep working each side until we've used up all of these stitches. So let's do another row, another few rows. So we slip our first stitch, knit to 1 stitch before the gap. And there we are. We're going to SSK the stitch before the gap and the stitch after the gap together. Knit them together through the back, knit 1, and then we turn. And then we're going to do the same for the purl row. We slip 1 purlwise. We're going to purl to that gap 1 stitch before. here I am. So we're going to purl the stitch before the gap and the stitch after the gap together, and that closes up that gap. We purl one more and we turn our work. So once you've done this, you've actually worked short rows, and you're going to continue until you've used all the stitches to either side, working back and forth on this center, working to that gap, closing the gap, and knitting one extra stitch on either side. Now my heel turn is almost complete. I have one stitch left on each edge, and depending on your stitch count, that will affect how many stitches you have on the end, whether you can finish with your decrease and a knit one, or whether you just finish with the decrease. So let's knit across and take care of that final stitch. You can see the gap is right there between those last two. So I don't have enough here to actually do the whole SSK knit one, which is fine. We're just going to do an SSK and we'll be done, and we'll have used all of the stitches on this side. Your stitch count, you might still have that knit one, so you would do your SSK and you would knit one, and then you'd use up the rest of your stitches. So it doesn't matter. You might end with a decrease, you might end with your decrease plus your knit one. So I'm going to repeat that for this last stitch over here. We're still slipping our first stitch, purling across to our final gap. So there's my gap between these two. So at the same as the other side, I have no purl one over here. I'm going to purl two together. If I had one more stitch, I would do that final purl one, but in my stitch count, I don't end up with that. Now I have all of my stitches are now on one needle. We've worked all of those stitches to either side. So we turn, and there is what we created with those short rows. We've turned the direction of our sock from this way. Now we can go this way. So it's almost like a little bit of magic with that yarn and needles. Short rows can help you change direction. So now that you've finished with the heel turn, the next step is this part of the sock right here, our gusset. This gives us extra fabric because we have a wider foot at this point than we do down here. So we've got to accommodate that, and we get extra stitches right here in this gusset, and we're going to use those stitches that we slipped to pick up the gusset stitches. But like I said, if you didn't slip those stitches, it's totally fine. You don't actually have to slip stitches to pick up stitches. It just helps you keep track of how many rows you've worked in your heel flap, and it also helps guide you while you're picking up stitches. But basically, you're going to pick up one stitch for every 2 rows in your heel flap. But because we slipped a stitch, we already have one stitch for every 2 rows along the edge. So we're going to pick up using those slipped stitches as our guide. So during this process of picking up our gusset stitches and joining to work back in the round again, we're going to be reconfiguring our needles, and our new beginning of round is going to end up right here. But it's going to be a process to get there because we have stitches to pick up on either side. So to start, you're going to take your empty needle and your heel stitches, and you're just going to knit across these stitches. Okay, we're going to set this needle down for now, and we're going to pick up our gusset stitches along this edge. For me, I have to pick up 18, plus I'm going to pick up an extra one up here in the corner, because where that gusset and where the heel flap and gusset meets the top of the sock, sometimes you can have a gap. So I like to pick up an extra stitch right there in that corner to help close up any potential gaps. So in my case, I've got 18 slipped stitches along this edge. So I'm going to pick up those 18. I'm going to use those as my guide to pick up stitches, and then one extra up here in the corner to help close up the gap. Depending on the length of your heel flap, you'll have more or less. If you forgot to slip a stitch and you don't have those stitches as a guide, Doesn't really matter. You can pick up a normal stitch. You'll just skip a row when you get to that point. I'm going to pick up a stitch in every single one of these slipped stitches. But if I had forgotten to slip one, say I forgot right here, then I would just pick up a stitch there, skip one, and then continue on, as long as you end up with the number that you need plus 1 to close up that hole. So I'm going to just do that with the needle that has my heel stitches. I'll take my yarn, and I'm using those slipped stitches as a guide. And you can see, if I turn it this way, you can see the V of that stitch. And we're going to use the 2 legs. I prefer to go under both legs of that stitch to get a nice, good hold. You can pick up one leg if you want. For me, I think it's a bit loose to do that, so I like to pick up both legs. So you're going to have to turn it, find both legs of that stitch, get them on your needle, wrap the yarn to make a new stitch, pull it through, and there you go. You've picked up and knit a stitch from that slipped stitch edge. So you're just going to repeat that. There's my next little V. So I'm going under both legs, wrapping to make a new stitch, pulling it through, and there is my stitch. And you just repeat this process using your slipped stitches as a guide. Like I said, if you forgot to slip a stitch, it's perfectly fine. Say I had forgotten right here, then I would just use this stitch. Say that was an edge stitch. I would go under the legs of that stitch, just that single stitch, and then I would skip the next stitch. I wouldn't pick up a stitch here, and that would still get me to the same count. So if you forgot to slip a stitch, not something that you'd have to be concerned about. I split a stitch right there, so I just dropped it back out, and I'm going to try again. So there's nothing that says you have to keep the stitch that you pick up. So if you've picked up in the wrong spot, just push it off and try it again. And as you get closer to this top needle up here, it can start to get in the way, so you've just got to adjust things and try to move things so you can get to where you need to be. Okay, I'm going to check and make sure. I had 20 heel stitches, plus I should have about 18 or 19 at this point. So I picked up all of my gusset stitches, plus I picked up an extra one right there at the edge. I could if I wanted to, if I think there's going to be a hole, pick up that bar and work those two together, but I'm going to leave it the way it is for now. If I notice it's going to be a hole in the next row, then I can still close it up there. So now this needle is pretty full. We've got all of our heel stitches plus one whole side. This whole side here is all on one needle. So we're ready to move on to our next needle. Okay, so for this one, we're going to now put all of our instep stitches on one needle. Well, before our heel flap, we had done just the opposite. All of our heel stitches were on one and our instep was on two, but we're going to reverse that at this point. So I'm going to knit across both of these needles with this needle and get all of those instep stitches onto one needle. So this is needle 1 at this point. I'm working on needle 2. Just going to knit across both of these. Okay, so we have part of our sock, our heel, 1 gusset, all of our instep stitches are here on needle 2, and now we have to get the gusset stitches for this side of the sock. So we're going to pick up the same number of stitches as we did over here. Pick up 1 right in the corner, and then 18 in my case along my heel flap right here. I'm going to use those slipped stitches again as my guide, just like we did over here. So this is needle 1, needle 2, and we're about to use needle 3. Okay, so I picked up all of the gusset stitches plus 1 extra, and I'm going to continue knitting to the center of the heel. So in my case, I have 20 stitches in my heel, so I'm going to knit 10 more stitches. And this part can feel a little weird because we've got so many stitches on this needle. So this is going to be the new beginning of round right here. So we can take our marker and move it to that location. And it's going to stay at this point for the remainder of the sock. All right, so we have a lot of stitches on here now, and it's time to start getting rid of some of these stitches. We're going to decrease our gusset stitches. That's where you can see this line on either side of the sock where those decreases are created. So we've done our heel flap, we've picked up our stitches, or we've turned our heel, we picked up stitches on both sides, and now we have a lot of stitches on either side of our heel. We're going to start decreasing them right along that edge. So how that looks is, while it's on our needle, this is the bottom of that, our little heel is down here where we turned our heel. That's the center of our stitches. We're going to knit to the end of this needle, leaving a few stitches. We're going to decrease right here. Then we work across our instep stitches just the way they are. We're not going to do anything to them. We get to our third needle. We're going to work our decrease here and then knit to the end. And that's all we're going to do. We're going to decrease on one round, and then another round we're going to knit. And then you continue doing that until you are back down to your regular stitch count. In my case, it is 72 stitches. So of course I have a lot more than that on my needles right now. So I'm going to continue decreasing one stitch at each side. So decreasing 2 stitches every other round until I'm back down to 72 stitches. So now that we are in our new configuration, let's work around so you can see what we're doing to decrease those stitches. So I want to get my needles back the way I like them. This one on top, this one on the bottom. So we're at our new beginning of round. I'm going to knit until I get to the last 3 stitches over here. And now I'm going to work my decrease. On this side, it's going to be a knit 2 together. So I'm going to knit 2 together and then knit 1. This is also where I can look and see if I think there's going to be a hole right there. I think it might be okay. If I were concerned, what I would do is pick up this little bar, and I'm going to put it up on this needle. And I'm done with this needle now. So I'm going to go to this one, and I'm going to knit that little bar together with that first stitch. I'm only going to do this once. I'm not going to do it more than once. I'm going to look. I actually think that makes it look worse. It pulled up and made a hole right there. So I'm not going to do that. I don't think I'm going to have a hole here at all. Just picking up that extra gusset stitch should be enough. But if you think there's going to be a hole, you can pick up the bar in between and just knit it together with a stitch on either side, and that should help close it up. So this is our instep stitches. Nothing special going on here. We're just going to knit straight across these stitches. So I've got my needle underneath, and to make sure I don't get a ladder along that edge, and I'm just going to knit across. And I can do the same at this point. If I think I'm going to have a hole, then I could pick up that little bar that's in between. But I think I'm going to be all right on this side. So on this side, we're going to decrease right here. So we're going to knit 1, knit it firmly to close up anything that might be gaping open right there. And then we're going to work an SSK on this side. And then knit to the end. And that is what you're doing on your decrease rounds. So we've finished one round, and the next round of our gusset decrease section is just to knit. You're going to knit around all the stitches, nothing special happening. And then you're just going to repeat those 2 rounds until you're back to your regular stitch count that you started with. In my case, that is 72 stitches. So I have 36 stitches here. I want to end up with 18 stitches here and 18 stitches here. The other half of my stitches, I'll have 36 here, 36 here. That would give me 72. So whatever your stitch count is, you'll have half of them here, and then the other half of your stitch count will be divided between this needle and this needle. So you're going to continue decreasing go down needle 1 to the last 3 stitches, knit 2 together, knit 1, work across your instep stitches, and then on needle 3, you'll knit 1, work in SSK, knit to the end of the round, and then you follow that by a knit round. Just keep doing that until you're back to your stitch count. Getting ready to work my last set of decreases. This is my last decrease on this side. You can see that decrease line right there where we've been removing all of those gusset stitches. So now I have just 18 stitches on this half of the heel. I've got 36 stitches across the instep, and I'm going to decrease one more and I'll have 18 stitches here. That gives me a total of 72 stitches, 36 for the instep and 36 for the heel. And my last decrease right here on this edge, knit 1, SSK. So from this point on, we are knitting the foot of the sock, the whole length of the foot. I don't have any more decreasing to do. I have the full stitch count that I started with when I cast on. I'm back to that number now. I've removed all those extra gusset stitches, so there's plenty of room for that heel ankle part where you have a larger foot at that point. I'm back at the beginning of my round. We're going to keep our marker at this point. This is going to stay as our new beginning of round until it's time to work our toes. So for this part, we've finished all of those decreases. You can see that line right there. For this length of the sock, you're just knitting every single round. This is the fun part, just plain old knitting. Now to decide how long your sock should be, you want it to be about 2 inches less than the total length, because it's going to take us about 1.5 inches to work the toe, 1.5 inches to 2 inches to work the toe. You also want to have a bit of negative ease for the length. So what I like to do is take the length of my foot and subtract 2 inches, and that will give you about enough for the length of the toe, along with a bit of ease so it will stretch over your foot this way and stay in place, so it's not going to be really floppy. So to measure that, you could use a ruler and just measure as you go. Stop and measure as you're knitting to make sure it's getting long enough. You want to measure from the heel, measuring the whole length to as long as you need it to be minus those 2 inches, or you can use something like a sock ruler. You can pop that right into your sock, just like that, and get the heel in place. And then check your measurements here against how long your sock needs to be. So that's all there is. I'm just going to keep knitting until the sock is as long as I need it to be. And after you've knit the first one, then just try to keep track of how many rows you knit, and you're just going to aim for that target number on the next sock. I finished knitting the foot of the sock and I'm ready to start my toe. And I'm back at my beginning of round, right where we place that marker after finishing our heel. We're on the bottom of the sock. If it helps, you can move your marker up to that location so you know where it is. So we are going to start decreasing to create this wedge toe that you see right here. And how that is worked is stitches are divided still for the top of the foot and the bottom of the foot. And we are decreasing along this edge here and this edge here, and then the same on the other half of the sock. So how that looks on our double pointed needles, we're right here in the middle of the sock. We're going to knit to the end of this needle, make a decrease here, turn our work, and then decrease here, work to the end, decrease here, turn our work again, and decrease here, and knit to the end of the round. And that will make those decreases at those 4 points, 2 here, and then 2 on the top of the foot as well. But because we're in the middle, instead of having our marker on the side where we could just start here and work our increases and decreases and the same on that side, it sort of changes the one that's on the bottom of the leg, just the way they're worked. We're working the first one and then we have to come all the way back around and work the second. So let's start by working that. So this is needle 1. We're going to knit across needle 1 to the last 3 stitches. And then just like our gusset stitches, we're going to do a knit two together and a knit one. And that is the first decrease on the toe for the sole of the foot side. Then we turn and we're going to work both decreases for the top of the foot. So now working across needle 2, get myself in position. We're going to knit 1, SSK, and that's our first decrease on this side. There, and then knit across the stitches to the last 3 stitches on this needle. And then we work our next decrease for this side, which is a knit 2 together. And then a knit 1, and that takes care of the decreases on the top of the foot. And then we turn our work and we're going to finish our final decrease for the bottom of the toe. So we knit 1, this is needle 3, we are knitting 1, we're doing an SSK, and then we'll knit to the end of this needle back to the beginning of round. So we're going to do this every other round. This next round, I'm just going to knit around. I'm not decreasing at all. And then I'm going to repeat that decrease row. And you're going to do that until the pattern tells you how many stitches you should have. Usually it's about 50% of your stitches. So I have 72 stitches. I'm going to decrease until I have about 36 stitches. So I'll have 18 stitches on this needle and then 9 stitches on each of these. So I'm going to alternate doing those decrease rounds where I'm decreasing 4 stitches, alternate that with a knit round. And that's what you're going to do until you have that new stitch count according to the pattern. So I finished that section of the toe. You can see it's starting to be shaped right here by decreasing 1 round, working a plain knit round, and then decreasing and then working a plain knit round and repeating that until I have about 50% of my stitches remaining. I started with 72. I now have 36. Now I'm going to work just the decrease round without that knit round in between. I'm going to decrease 4 stitches every single round in exactly the same way. Knit to the end of this needle, the last 3 stitches, work a decrease here, knit to the end, and work a decrease, turn my work again, and work another decrease. And that's 4 stitches I'll be decreasing. So I'll keep repeating that decrease round until I have about 20% of my total stitch count, which for me is going to be about 16 stitches. So I'll have 8 stitches on this needle and then 8 more stitches divided between these 2 needles. And then we'll be able to graft our toe. That is this little bit right in the very center. We don't have a seam or anything like that. We do a little bit of grafting to make it look seamless right there. And that is the only thing left to do. I finished my toe, so I just have a few stitches remaining that we're going to graft. First of all, I am going to knit these 4 stitches right here to get to this side over there. There, that's just so we can form our graft. And we will take out our marker. We don't need that anymore. We have all of our stitches now on these 2 needles. The stitches for the bottom of the foot, the sole of the foot, and then the stitches for the top of the foot. And they are divided just like that. So we can put a graft right here on those stitches that remain. So you're going to want to cut your yarn or break your yarn, but leave a decent sized tail so you can make a new row of stitches right there. And then you'll want to thread that onto a tapestry needle. And there is a setup, but I prefer to skip it because I think you end up with like these little points on the side. So I didn't put them here because I think it makes a smoother join. If you want to do those little setup stitches, all you need to do is insert your tapestry needle into this first stitch on the front. You're going to insert it as if to purl, but leave the stitch on there. You'll insert it and pull your yarn through. And then you'll go to the back needle. You'll insert as if to knit into this back stitch. Leave the stitch on there. You're just going to wrap the yarn around those 2 stitches. I prefer to skip that and just get right to working the Kitchener graft. And then from there, it is just a 2-step process. On the front needle, we're going to insert into that first stitch, right into the legs of the stitch, as if to knit, and we're going to drop it off the needle. Careful not to drop any stitches on the back needle. They can slip off. And then on that the second stitch on that first needle, which is now the first stitch, you're going to insert as if to purl, but you're going to leave it on there. You're not taking it off yet. You're going to pull your yarn through. But the thing to know here is you're making a new row of knitting. This isn't a seam, so don't pull it tight. You want it to look like the stitches above and below. You want to create a little row of stitches, so don't yank it tight. You're not making a seam. You want to keep it looking like the stitches above and below, and we can adjust them, but just give it a little tug. You want to tighten it a little, but you don't want it tight. It's not a seam. So we've finished with our front needle, and now we're going to move to the back. Now the first stitch on the back is the opposite. We're going to insert as if to purl and drop that stitch off the needle. And then that second stitch we insert as if to knit, and we leave it on. And we pull our yarn through, remembering we're making a stitch. We don't need to make this super tight. We just want to close up that gap and make another row of stitches. And then we come back to the front and we just repeat those steps. Knit on, or knit off, I should say. So you enter as if to knit, you drop it off, and you enter the next stitch as if to purl, and you leave it on. Pulling your yarn through, and then we move to the back needle and we do the opposite. We enter as if to purl and pull the stitch off, and then we enter into the next stitch as if to knit, and we leave it on the needle. And then back to the front. Knit off, purl on. And the back again. Purl off, knit on. And I'm stopping and pulling that so it's starting to look like a little row of stitches underneath there. And you're just going to continue until you get to the end of your stitches. And I'm down to my final 2. Just like at the beginning, you're technically supposed to leave this final stitch on there to work again, but I don't. I just work it once. I don't try to work it twice. So I'm pulling it right off. If you wanted to work it, you would leave it on there, finish the back, and then come back to this one and knit off that final stitch. It will be the first step of the first process. And the same with this back stitch. It is purl off and then knit on, and then when you come back to it, you would purl this one off. But I just take them right off the needle. And then this is where I look at the toe, and I try to, you can see right there, it looks a little wonky. So I want to pull some of this excess yarn over here. So I'm just going to use the legs of the stitch and pull up on some of that knitting. Hopefully I have the right row. It could be the row above and I am working on the wrong one, but we'll see. Nope, there I go. It's attached to this one right here, so I can pull out that excess. That looks a lot better. Of course, I'm going to wash my socks. I don't really block them. I do have a sock blockers. I might put them on there the first time just to even things out, but even that's not necessary. But washing them will help even things out as well. But if your graft doesn't look very nice, you can pull some of that excess over. That looks a lot better. Not perfect, but much better. And then at this point, I look for any loose stitches. Sometimes, like this stitch, it's the last stitch I came out of, looks a bit loose. So I'm going to just try to, when I bring my needle to the inside of the fabric, I want to make sure I'm tightening up on that stitch. And I think if I go this way and pull it through, that will tighten up on that final purl stitch. So I won't get a weird looking ear on that side of the fabric. So I just pull it through, give it a little tug, and then I evaluate. I think that looks pretty good. It is poking up bad a little bit, but not too bad. Can stretch things out. Give that yarn tail a tug again. I think that is fine. So I'm just going to weave in my tails and give this a wash and a block, and they'll be ready to wear. So now you have finished your first pair of socks on double pointed needles. So for weaving in the ends, all I would do here is just weave it right down in along there. I'll demonstrate that for you. And if you haven't gotten the pattern yet, you'll find that linked down below. It comes in, I think, 11 sizes, from like a child size sock all the way up to an adult man. So if you just want to knit a practice sock just to get down the idea of it, you can do that. So I do look on the top here. I want to make sure everything looks nice along this top edge. So I'm going to insert right here under the legs of this stitch, and then come back down right here. Then there's no gap there, and it just makes it look as invisible as possible. Like you can't really tell where that cast on point was. And then from here, I just take the tip of my needle and I run down the legs in the columns of one of the stitches, one of the knit stitches on this side, but on the other side, it's a purl stitch. So you're not going to see that yarn poking through over here. So I go down one side, and then I might come up and around and do like one little duplicate stitch, or maybe two right here. Go up this way. And then I'm going to come back down just a few stitches on this side, and that should be plenty to hold this in place. And using the legs of these stitches hides that yarn tail on the other side. You can't see that at all. It's not poking through. So I can trim that now. That should be enough to hold it. If you're feeling like it's not very secure or the yarn is slippery, then you could repeat that going down the next leg over here. But I think that's probably going to be just fine. So I'll trim that after, and then I'll weave in my other tail, and the socks are finished. So if you haven't already, be sure to grab that pattern and knit a pair of socks with me. If you've been following along with the tutorial, then you've completed your first sock, and now it's time to cast on and knit the second sock. If you haven't been following along and just watching the tutorial, what are you waiting for? Click down below on that pattern, download it, and start knitting with me. There's actually more that we could discuss though about socks, and that's specifically about sock yarn. Sometimes yarns are labeled sock yarn, but they're really not that great for knitting socks. So in this video right here, we discuss 6 different things that you can do to make sure your socks are going to last a really long time. They take a lot of time to knit, and you want them to last. So click right there on that video, and I'll see you over there.